Okay. So welcome to the NIH Grant Writing Series. My name is Maggie Berg. I'm a Research Development Manager at the Interdisciplinary Health Sciences Institute, or IHSI. I would like to begin today by recognizing and acknowledging that we are on the lands of the Peoria, Kaskaskia, Piankashaw, Wea, Miami, Mascoutin, Odawa, Sauk, Meskwaki, Kickapoo, Potawatomi, Ojibwe, and Chickasaw nations. These nations were the traditional territory, or these lands were the traditional territory of these native nations prior to their forced removal. These lands continue to carry the stories of these nations and their struggles for survival and identity. As a land-grant institution, the University of Illinois has a particular responsibility to acknowledge the peoples of these lands, as well as the histories of disposition that have allowed for the growth of this institution for the past 150 years. We are also obligated to reflect on and actively address these histories and the role that this university has played in shaping them. This acknowledgement and the centering of Native peoples is a start as we move forward for the next 150 years. So, as you all know, the Grant Writing Series is hosted by the Interdisciplinary Health Sciences Institute, and today's session will be on an introduction to the NIH. So before we get into that, I just wanted to give a little more information about the IHSI and what we can do to help you with your research. So IHSI has a team of research development managers, of which I'm one of them. We each focus on a different program area, although we are open to working with anyone who's doing health-related research. And we work with our team to launch centers, programs, and collaborations to build a more robust health sciences ecosystem and make grant-seeking efforts more successful. With this team, we are available for helping to build research teams. We can help find funding opportunities, and we can help with some proposal development as well. IHSI also has some research support services, including the Biostatistics, Epidemiology, and Research Design Core, or BIRD. We also have the Research Electronic Data Capture software, REDCap, and you can either contact me to learn more about these or go to our website. So we will be covering different aspects of the NIH grant writing process through six weeks of webinars. Those are all listed here. I do want to point out that this peer review workshop is not open to everyone, as the rest of the webinars are. This is just for our selected cohort of nominees. If you would like to learn more about how to be in that cohort in future years, you can contact me about that, and I can tell you more about how you can be nominated next year. So we want to kind of get started with a little poll to find out who's here and what everyone knows about NIH. So I'm going to launch this poll, and we'll take a few moments to just give your answers of who you are, how you rate your knowledge, and if you've ever applied for NIH funding. Okay, we've got almost everybody on here. It's probably just me and the speakers that haven't. So we will end the poll, and let's share the results. Okay, can everyone see these? I haven't done polls before. So yeah, we've got mostly, looks like assistant professors, postdocs and grad students, and research faculty and staff. Looks like most people would rate their knowledge of NIH as average, so that's pretty good. Hopefully you'll learn a few things today. And we're actually 50-50 with people who have applied for NIH funding in the past, so that's really interesting. Thank you. Sharing. Okay. All right. So today, as I said, this is going to be an overview of NIH. We'll talk about the grants process, including how to plan your application, what you need to do to prepare, finding funding mechanisms, what the different funding mechanisms are, as well as interacting with program officers. And so I am going to turn this over and let the presenter and panelists introduce themselves. We have Jody Flaws, Keith Kelly, and Lillian Windsor. And so I'll let Jody go first as our presenter.
So hi, welcome everybody. I'm Jody Flaws. I'm a professor in the Department of Comparative Biosciences and also have appointments in Animal Sciences, Beckman, the Division of Nutritional Sciences, and Carle, Illinois College of Medicine. I suspect that I was invited to be on this panel because I have a lot of experience writing grants and getting grants, not as much experience as I'd like in getting the grants, but I do have a long track record of funding from NIH. And I've also served numerous times on NIH study sections. And I'm currently now the chair of a study section at NIH called CMR, or Cellular Molecular Integrated Reproduction.
All right, let's hear from Keith Kelly.
Hi, I'm Keith Kelly. I am a retired professor from the university. I started here in '84. I was fortunate in that I kept about 30 continuous years of NIH funding, and I was unfortunate enough to sit on about 70 different NIH study sections. So I'm here to offer whatever advice I can, and I'm glad to see so many people are with us today.
All right, thank you. And Lillian?
Hi, everyone. I'm Lily Windsor. I am an associate professor and associate dean for research at the School of Social Work. I have been involved with NIH since about 2000. So I've applied several times and I've been funded through NIH as well. And currently I am a member of the NIH scientific review that is called, sorry, I'm going to read because it's a long name, HIV/AIDS Intra and Interpersonal Determinants and Behavioral Interventions Study Section, HIBI for short. So it's a pleasure to be here today.
All right, thank you so much. Before I turn this over to Jody, I'm going to go to the next slide because we have a little video. Everyone can just sit back for 5 minutes and watch this. Once I get
in NIH grant applications, perhaps the most common, especially among new investigators, is overambitiousness, just kind of spreading out and trying to cover too much territory.
If you do not convey the essence of the idea clearly, then no matter how good the idea is, it's lost. And so what we term as grantsmanship frequently on the panel is really the idea of efficiently and sometimes repetitively conveying what you want to do, what you will do, and how it will advance the science.
I would encourage any applicant to seek outside review before submitting the application. There are things you miss all the time. And you should take their advice seriously, take their critiques as important, and work on revisions before you actually make your grant application and submit it.
Well, the role of program directors, such as myself, is to advise applicants and to be advocates for them. An important part of the responsibility of a program director is to keep abreast of the particular field and research area that they're overseeing. And this can be an advantage to the applicants because they see it from a broader perspective.
I don't know anyone who gets positive results on every single grant application they submit. And the first one that gets rejected is the hardest, but they're never fun. And after that, you regroup and you just move on.
In fact, you will always receive a summary statement which contains the criticisms that were leveled at the grant by the study section members. It's very important to read these criticisms carefully and to take them into account and correct the application when you resubmit the grant.
You can read so many proposals, and yet one will stick out and hit you in the face as being an absolutely wonderful piece of literature. And for me, these contain, again, a lucid style, a very compelling creative scientific idea, and this idea of impact, of moving science in a mode towards a clinical end that is not only credible, but you think will make an enormous boost of capability or boost of therapeutic value to a patient population that currently is in some type of need.
You have a bunch of people looking at your proposal who are disposed to do well by you, who want to find an exciting idea and good science and support it and tell them a good story. Tell them a story about what you want to do, why you want to do it, and how you're going to do it.
There are essentially three elements of a proposal that get me really excited. The major hook, frankly, is the way it's presented. How clear is the language? How well do the ideas follow one from another? The second, and perhaps more important, is what is the quality of the idea? The third is the innovation. How much will this one study advance our knowledge of something that has eluded our consciousness for some time?
I would encourage any applicant to take part in reviewing activities such as they exist, perhaps reviewing manuscripts for journal, review an abstract for your professional meetings, and when invited to review for NIH, participate. You'll find that your applications get stronger and you learn a lot by reviewing and participating.
The best advice I could give to an applicant who's starting to write a proposal for the first time is to do your homework with respect to what NIH is looking for in a grant proposal. Get advice from your peers and mentors on what sort of proposal you should write and how you should write it. There's lots of information on the NIH website that will help you. There are many opportunities for funding.
Okay, so I'm going to turn it over to Jody. I'm going to stop sharing.
Share my screen. So is my screen sharing?
Yes.
And can everybody hear me okay and see my cursor? Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about the grant cycle at NIH. And this is a bit of a cartoon, but how we all think it's supposed to work going into this is you write a grant, you get money, you do the research, you publish the results, then use those results to write a grant. In reality, and this may be a little bit specific to certain disciplines, you do the research, you may get results, but you may not want to publish them yet so that you could use them as preliminary results in your grant application. A lot of people, unfortunately, end up writing grants to do what they already did, getting the money, and then using the money to pay for an unrelated project. This is probably not the ideal thing you want to do. I think we want to do what's in the top is probably the preferred.
And I just wanted to jump in here and make a note that in the social sciences, the reality tends to be much closer to how it's supposed to be, except that you are supposed to do some pilot research first, and then show those results in your grant application. Then you get the money, you do the research you propose to do, and you in fact adhere to that plan fairly closely. Then you publish the results and you start all over again.
Can I make a comment? Of the people I know who are extremely successful in getting grants, your lower plot describes exactly what they do.
Yeah.
People at Harvard
So I'm going to go on and we're going to talk a little bit about NIH. And I know that about half of the group is familiar with it, and the other half, it seemed like from the poll, is not as familiar. So I just want to give some background that NIH is the largest source of funding for medical research in the world. And their mission is to seek fundamental knowledge about the nature and behavior of living systems and the application of that knowledge to enhance health, lengthen life, reduce illness, and disability. And I want to make a comment based on my study section experience. Sometimes there's this wrong impression that everything going to NIH has to be directly relevant to humans. That is not true. Many, many study sections, including the one I'm on, and many institutes at NIH are really interested in basic research. And they realize that it may be 40 years, 50 years before it has a direct link to humans. But as long as you're doing fundamentally important research, I don't think you need to be locked into this mindset that it has to immediately be relevant to humans. So NIH is composed of 27 institutes and centers. The head of these is in the Office of Director. And we've listed here all of the different institutes and centers. And I think one key thing I want to say is that when you're getting ready to submit a grant to NIH, you should find the institute that best fits your type of research. And you should read their strategic plan and read about that institute to make sure that your research fits there. The other thing you should do is contact a program officer at these institutes, run by the person your idea for research, and make sure that it is a good fit. Now, there are these institutes who then sort of feed into an NIH clinical center, a Center for Information Technology, and then Center for Scientific Review, which handles all of the review of applications. Now, they don't have funding authority. They pretty much abide by how the scoring at studies section, as well as some of the institute priorities in determining funding. And we put on the slide here that the federal appropriation to NIH is a bit over $41 billion. And then just highlighting a few of the institutes to show you what their appropriation is. So National Cancer Institute typically has the largest amount of money. Then we have things like allergy and infectious disease, general medical sciences, aging. So each of these has different appropriations, and you should be aware of them because sometimes when you're submitting a grant, your grant may fall into more than one institute. So for example, I do research on reproductive toxicology, and so my grants could easily be reviewed by NICHD, which is Child Health and Human Development, as well as Environmental Health Sciences. And I will often ask for my grant to be dual listed, and the reason is both of these institutes have their own federal appropriation. And so if one of them doesn't have money to fund my grant, if it gets a good score, the other one may. So I think it's important that you realize that sometimes you can dual list your application, and you want to look carefully at what their appropriations are to see if it might be reasonable that they could fund your work. So this is a slide just to show you how University of Illinois compares. So in FY19, we had 214 awards from NIH that totaled $84 million. These circles here, the outer circle is showing funding amounts, or where the funding comes from, and the inner is the awards. And this second chart is just to show you where our funding is coming from and where the awards are coming from. So these are the different NIH institutes. To show you that U of I, we're actually doing pretty well getting funding from lots of different institutes. The largest seems to be general medicine. This pie chart is showing funding by activity code. So we're going to talk about the different types of grants that are available at NIH. Grants that have an R in the number of them, or the title of them, those are research-based grants. Ones that have a T tend to be training grants. U series tend to be contracts, and then P series tend to be center or program project grants. Now, of the R grants, there are different kinds. The R01 is the investigator-initiated 5-year research grant. And you can see that at Illinois, this is a large bulk of our funding is in R01. And then same when you look at the activity code, most of our grants tend to be R01s. There are other types of research grants that we'll talk about, as well as training grants and some of the program grants. So just so that everybody's aware that during this pandemic, NIH has actually set aside appropriations for COVID emergency funding through the CARES Act, the Paycheck Protection Program, and the Coronavirus Preparedness and Response Supplemental Act. So these are special funds that people can apply for if they are doing research related to COVID-19. And this funding is meant to be given like in an emergency when we have a declared disaster or health emergency. And they're given very quickly to address a public health crisis that was really unforeseen at the time. And so far we have 12 proposals submitted from Illinois and 1 administrative supplement awarded so far. The other thing to keep in mind is that NIH is really setting aside funding to do what's called diversity, equity, and inclusion. These are funds for proposals that address health disparities and improve inclusion as an area of interest. And this applies through all of NIH Institute. So one example I can give you is for research, I'm just going to use toxicology as an example because that's what I know best. If historically there were studies looking at certain chemicals either in men or male animals, there are now supplements for people to do studies in females so that we can make sure females are included in these studies and look at health disparities or sex differences between males and females. There are some funding opportunities application or FOAs where NIH will specifically ask researchers to submit grants where they're going to address health disparities and state how their findings will impact minority populations. And for people that do have existing grants or programs, often NIH will give an administrative supplement for promoting diversity in the scientific workforce, either by having diversity in students and postdocs, or sometimes with junior faculty, there are possibilities there as well. So I want to talk a little bit about the grants process and an overview. So it's really, really important to plan and prepare your grant application. Even before you start writing it, you should make sure that you have your idea solidified, you have your data, your preliminary data, you have a plan. Then you write the application, submit it to NIH. It will then be reviewed by NIH. If you're lucky, you'll get a good enough score that you'll have pre-award and it will be awarded. If you have to revise, you have to go through this cycle over again. And one thing I want to say on this slide is that it's really important to realize that the government is really, really slow. So from the time you submit your grant, generally until you have it reviewed is about 4 months. And then after you review the grant, after the grant is reviewed, it can be anywhere from 1 month to 2 months before you even get your comments or summary statement to be able to revise and put it back in. So keep that in mind when you're planning and preparing, that it's not going to be you submit it and 2 weeks later you have an answer like you were submitting a paper. It's several months between submitting and even getting it reviewed. So
a quick note on that also, there are certain types of applications that have faster review. So usually applications going through the HIV cycle. And now also with the COVID calls for applications, they are on an expedited basis. So you can get the actual funding in as little as 2 months in some cases.
Yep. That's a great point. You really need to read what the request for applications or the certain rules are related to the type of grant you're submitting. It's really important to start early. You really need to talk to mentors or colleagues and do a lot of reading to make sure your research is original. You need to spend time collecting preliminary data and getting statistical assistance as needed. And just to reiterate that BIRD core can help with study design and do things like power calculations and help you with your statistical plan. And I will say the study sections now, we have to place a lot more emphasis on what they're calling rigor and reproducibility. And all the grants, at least coming to my study section, always have very clear paragraphs on power calculation, statistical design. It's really critical. If you don't have it, your grant will not do well during the review. You need to find and understand funding opportunities. So for most R grants, you can always submit what's called an investigator-initiated grant, where you don't need a special call for applications. It can be on a topic that's important to that institute. But there are certain requests for funding where it does have a different deadline, it does have different criteria. They're looking for specific topics, and you have to meet certain criteria to be able to respond. So you need to make sure what you're applying for and that you're going to meet the specified review criteria. And then you really need to pay attention to internal institutional processes and deadlines. And we'll talk a little bit about that in more detail. So one useful tool in seeing what has been funded and kind of giving an idea of what types of studies in your particular area get funded is to look on the NIH Recorder. And this is the website here. And what's really, really nice about this is you can search. So say, for example, you're interested in liver toxicology. You can type in liver, or if you're interested in cancer, you can type in liver cancer. And you can find out similar projects that have been funded. If you want to know if a certain person, what their funding profile looks like, you can even search by people. Now, when you do searching by keywords in your area of interest, you can find out which institute of NIH funds those type of projects. And then you can take it a step further. You can then identify which program officials in that institute are associated with the project. So when you search on the recorder, it will tell you the institute that's funding a certain grant, and it will tell you the program official that's associated with that grant. And if you're looking for a collaborator, you can also find out who's funded in that area and have an idea of who might be a good collaborator. And I want to say something about program officials at NIH a little bit here, and I'll say a little bit more as we get further into this. So these are people that work at NIH, and their job is really to help investigators obtain funding. And the good program officers will be willing to look at your specifics aims page and give you feedback. They'll be willing to talk to you about whether they think their particular institute will fund the grant. After submission, good program officers will also often listen into the review. They cannot comment on the review, and they have no say-so in the review process, but they can listen and take notes and then report back to you some of the things that the reviewers were saying, and report back to you some of the biggest issues that you may need to focus on if you have to revise. So one thing I'll say is some program officers are really good and will do all of these things. Not all of them are really good. So don't be disappointed if you get a program officer that's not as helpful. Okay. So there are different types of funding opportunity announcements. So the first kind are called the parent announcements. So these are broad FOAs, or funding opportunity announcements. These are what I was talking about, where an investigator has an idea, has a novel hypothesis on a topic that's going to be of interest to one of the institutes. You can submit a grant at any of the 3 deadlines. Many institutes participate in these kind of announcements. And on average, the The announcements gets changed every 3 years, but they're ongoing. And they have some standard due dates that we'll talk about. There are things called program announcements. Now, these are announcements that are issued by one or more institutes at NIH that highlight areas of scientific interest. So NIH institutes may partner and say, boy, we really need some studies in this area. There's a big lack of information. And they'll put together a program announcement that will specify that they're looking for certain areas of interest. And they'll hope to encourage applications for new or ongoing programs. These program announcements, they're usually available. They have standard due dates. And they have, oops, sorry, they have several different funding mechanisms. So one are called PAS. These are announcements where NIH has literally set aside special funds to fund grants that come in a certain area of interest. These are the best kind to apply for because they're set aside money dedicated to that area of interest. PARs, they are announcements where they say, yes, we're interested in these. We might give you special considerations during the review process if you're focused on this topic, but we don't have any set aside funding. And then finally, there's something called NOSIs, which are notices of special interest. These formerly used to be referred to as RFAs, or requests for applications. Sorry. And these can have set aside funding as well. So requests for applications, these are issued by one or more institutes to highlight well-defined areas of interest. Sorry for my coughing. I'm at home. I don't have COVID. I'm having allergies. They highlight scientific interest. These often will have set aside funds, and they will tell you how much money they're setting aside and how many applications that they're going to fund in this area. They usually have a single due date, and that due date is usually very fast. They're typically within 90 days to 2 months after they release the RFA. And they're reviewed by special panels. And one key thing is you absolutely have to make sure that the science you're proposing fits the scope of the RFA. Because if it doesn't, no matter how good the project is, no matter how exciting it is, they will not even review it and they will not fund it. So you have to make sure that you fit with needs. Now I want to comment on different funding mechanisms. So there are things called the R series, which are research project grants. These have several different kinds. So there's the R01, which are individual initiated research grants. These tend to be the most common. In most fields, you can apply for up to 5 years of funding at $250,000 per year. There's something called an R03, or a small research grant. Not every institute has these, so you have to make sure that your institute has these. They are for 2 years. They're what are called small research grants. They're to fund projects that are small projects that can be done in 2 years at $50,000 direct cost per year. And then there's finally something called R21 or R33 grants, which are exploratory developmental grants. These are meant to fund science that is really high impact or risky or developing a new novel technique or exploring something. I want to emphasize that these are not small R01s. People often make the mistake of thinking that they're going to put in an R21 and it's really a small R01. If you're going to write a small R01, just write an R01 that's for 3 years instead of 5 years. These R21s have a much higher bar for review, And if reviewers don't think it's exploratory or risky or innovative enough, those typically don't do very well. Then there are things called K-series. These will apply to a lot of faculty, junior faculty, as well as some postdocs. And these are meant to be mentored awards where either you're an early stage research scientist who are trying to develop, or you're doing career transition, or the K99 R00s, which are for postdocs to fund their last couple of years of postdoc and the first 3 years of their faculty position. Some other types of grants that I'm not going to spend too long on because I'm anticipating most people on this Zoom are going to be interested in the R and the K grants. But there are training grants, which are institutional grants that will fund pre-docs and postdocs. There are fellowship grants for graduate students and postdocs. There are S-series, which are for research-related programs, particularly to help support minority biomedical research support. Program grants, which are your typical center grants, and then cooperative agreements or the use. So let's talk a little bit more about the R-series grants. In addition to the regular initiated grants, if you have an R-like grant that's high risk, high reward research, there is additional funding through the NIH Common Fund. There are grant opportunities for exceptionally creative science, highly innovative research with the potential for broad impact in biomedical, behavioral, or social sciences. They have several different programs that you should look at. There's the Pioneer Award, the New Innovator Award, the Transformative Research Award, and Early Independence Award. Now, these typically have annual deadlines in August and September. Some of them will only allow so many to come from each university, and so you have to check on the announcement. And if you are planning to apply, you need to check with the university to see what process you need to go through to be one of the people that can submit one of these awards. So to find funding, you can search that NIH reporter, but you can also search the NIH site to look for funding opportunity announcements or FOAs. They will list all of the announcements that are parent announcements. They will list any special RFAs or notice of awards or request for funding. You can also subscribe to NIH Weekly. You can follow NIH funding on Twitter. You can subscribe to the Illinois OVCR Research Funding Opportunities email list. This is a very good list to be involved in because outside of NIH, you will get information on funding opportunities from lots of different places. And subscribe to the IHSI program area newsletters. And if you have started to develop a relationship with an NIH staff person, you can talk to that person to make sure you're selecting an appropriate announcement to apply for. So this is just a table to show you the different submission dates. So NIH grants, other than the special announcements, typically have 3 different due dates or 3 times a year you can apply. The R grants, the new grants, are typically due February 5th, June 5th, and October 5th, if it's a brand new submission. If it's a renewal, resubmission, or a revision, they're usually March 5th, July 5th, and November 5th. And then if you're looking at some of the other R series awards, the due dates are usually mid-February, June, and October. And then for grad students and postdocs, the deadlines are listed here as well. And then the K series, including the K99s for postdocs, their due dates are shown here. So some things you need to think about in your planning is you need to find out early on if there's a grants coordinator in your department or college. So if you don't know already, make sure you contact your business office to find out what's available as far as help with the budget, the forms, interpretation of guidelines. I know this is pretty uneven across campus, so you need to know what your department has or your unit has so you can plan accordingly. You also can reach out to IHSI, the Research Development Team, because they are very skilled and can be very helpful in processing and proposal development. There are resources on the SPA website that could be helpful. If you don't know who the proposal coordinator is in your department, you can look that up on the SPA website. And SPA is also the administrative office that will help you create an ERA Commons account, which you need in order to be able to submit NIH grants. And then one thing you have to be aware of is that proposals in their final form need to be submitted to SPA at least 4 days prior to the sponsor deadline. If you don't get it in 4 days before the deadline to SPA, you really risk them not being able to submit your grant to NIH on time. So some things, again, going back to the pandemic, that it has affected funding opportunities. There has been, given by NIH, some flexibility and accommodation regarding deadlines or delays. But you need to, if you think you're going to have a delay related to COVID-19, you need to make sure with NIH that you are going to be allowed to submit the application late or have a delay. Because of the pandemic, it's also affected NIH's ability to get their work done. So they're having some delays in submitting their request for some special funding announcements. When they do come out, make sure you're reading the instructions carefully. And then keep checking the NIH website where they list information that's constantly updated about COVID-19 and its impact on applicants and recipients of funding. So I think this is probably a good place to stop and have a little bit of discussion around finding funding and choosing a funding mechanism.
Yeah, so this might be a good time to maybe talk a little bit more about the differences between the social and biological sciences when preparing and applying for an NIH grant. I don't know if one of you would like to comment on that? More than one of you. I know.
So do you want to start with the biological sciences and I can follow up with the social sciences? Or maybe Keith?
So Maggie, you're asking me to talk about like different funding mechanisms?
Yeah, just your experience with like what do you usually do to find funding opportunities? How do you go about choosing a funding mechanism, like differences between R01, R21, that kind of thing?
So a lot of times I am really focused on the investigator initiated R01. So these are the kind that you can submit without a special call for applications at any of the 3 deadlines. And I'll decide that I'm ready to submit one if I really think I have a novel hypothesis and I've got preliminary data to support that hypothesis and have taken adequate time to write it, and I've got what I think are novel questions to ask. So that's the main focus I will have. I often will submit in response to a request for applications as long as I 100% fall into that request. So the research I do is on ovarian toxicology. So if there's a grant that's related to something related to the ovary or female reproduction or environmental health, where they're specifically asking for a call in that area, I will respond to that. And I will know they're asking for a call in that area because I'm always looking at the NIH website to see what new calls for applications they have. However, like if I see that the application or the call is looking for somebody that studies the liver or cancer, that's not what I do. So I'm not going to waste my time spending effort to do that because I'm not going to have the preliminary data. I'm not going to have the expertise. To determine whether I do an R01, R23, or I mean R21 or R03, when I first started my career, and this is some advice I give to our junior faculty, is If you've got a little bit of preliminary data and a good idea for a solid project that can be completed in a short period of time, and the institute you would apply to has them, I always suggest an R03 because it's a nice way to get some money, to get a project going, that you can then get preliminary data or get data from that project that can be used to really build a bigger grant such as an R01. If somebody has a research project that's what I would call high risk, high reward, or extremely innovative, I would encourage them to do the R21. There's this sort of false notion that for an R21, you don't have to have any preliminary data. That's completely, that says that on paper, but that's not the practice at NIH study sections. If you put in a grant in basic science, that's an R21 or an R03 without any preliminary data, it's not going to do very well. So I think if you have preliminary data that lends itself to developing a high risk, high reward, super innovative project, I would say do the R21. If it's more of a discrete, not super risky project, I would say an R03. And if you have a lot of preliminary data and a really well-developed idea, I would go through R01.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
Is an R21 a good vector to an R01?
It can be. It absolutely can be. If your R21 project is successful and you get good data that you can then use as preliminary data in an R01, or your results from the R21 kind of lead you in a certain path, it can be. But if on paper showing that you had an R21, that's not going to make the reviewers say, oh, they had an R21 on this project, let's give them an R01. So it's not a good vector in that way, but it's a good vector to get data or research focus.
So if you have an R01, it wouldn't be a good idea to then go for an R21. I'm asking, if you have an R21, is that a natural way to move into an R01?
It can be, if the data that you get or the direction you get from doing the R21 project sets you up for doing an R01. Yes, absolutely. So for example, I can give you an example. Say you write an R21 because you want to develop some novel mouse model that hasn't been developed before. And the mouse model you develop may or may not have the phenotype you're hoping. So you could write an R21, it's risky, but if you can compel the reviewers that it's really important to develop this mouse model, you may be able to get the funding to do it. And then you develop that mouse model, and it is a very useful tool, then you would be able to then use that to transition into an R01 application based on you've got this mouse and now you're going to ask these questions.
Okay, thank
you. Does that make sense?
I would also argue that, and by the way, everything that Jody has said also applies in the social sciences, but I would not necessarily say if you have an R01, you shouldn't go for an R21. I think that it really depends on your research question and what you're trying to do. So if you want to get training, you want to go to a case series grant. If you have a new idea, it's an exploratory developmental study that needs strong pilot data first, you don't want to go with that straight for an R01 because you're not likely going to be getting funded. So you need to have that pilot data first. So it really, I think it really depends on your research question. Also for junior people that are just starting, I can't encourage you enough to maybe consider submitting for a K award. It protects your time for a total of 5 years. And it makes sure, it allows you to get a great deal of training that then can position you very well to go for the R01. Another thing that I've heard many times in terms of should I go for an R01, there's another mechanism also that's called the R34, which is more for clinical trials that are not as well developed as an R01 would be. It's kind of like the R21 version of a randomized clinical trial. And people have often thought about applying to those as a small R01 that does not apply either. In order to do the R34, it really needs to be a more developmental type of grant with developmental aims. And I also, in choosing what mechanism I go for and where does it fit, you also need to consider the institute. Sometimes you might have an idea that fits in more than one institute. So you definitely want to call the program officer and have some questions, because institutes also have very different approaches to different things. So some institutes, for instance, will be more likely to fund R01 that looks more like an R34, when there are other institutes that will absolutely not do that. There's also some nuances in terms of what they might be interested in or not. So it's absolutely critical to gather some ideas, but then run these ideas by the program officer. The other thing in talking to the program officer is to keep in mind that they get credit not for successfully funded applications. They get credit for the number of applications that they bring in. So you should also take their advice with a grain of salt, knowing that they are much more likely to be super excited about your idea than discouraging your idea. But do listen to their feedback very closely, because they are well positioned to tell you where you want to go. And the last thing that people don't typically think about when they are, especially when they are starting, is the second level of review, which is a much more mysterious type of review, where the application actually goes to council. So in the scientific review, they get scored for scientific merit. But at the second level of review, they get the decision is made on which applications are going to be funded, and it's not necessarily always following the ranking. My mentor, for example, she had an application in the second percentile that did not get funded at the second level of review because of a match between what the priority is and the types of applications that the particular institute was looking at. So the PO can really help you with information on that, which is not necessarily the kind of information that's easy for applicants to find.
I have another short, I have a very unusual question. If you think it's inappropriate at this time, we can talk about it later, but let's say you have the choice of writing some papers or writing a grant. Can you say the amount of work that goes into writing a grant is equivalent to writing 2 papers that are going to be published, or 3 papers, or 1 paper? How would you do a comparison between your time spent writing and publishing a paper versus getting a grant?
Boy, I think that's going to be so dependent on the person and their writing skills. And some people are better and quicker at writing papers versus grants. And I think whether somebody chooses to write a paper or a grant also is going to depend a lot on their type of position. So in a state university like U of I, where in many departments our salary is supported by the state, I mean, there's still a lot of incentive to write grants, but that's a very different scenario than some of my colleagues when I was at University of Maryland, where they have to support themselves 100% on grants. So the priority they always give is writing grants as the expense of writing papers. I don't know how to answer it, because I think it really depends on somebody's position and their current funding status and the expectations of their department and how good they are with writing, because they're very different writing skills.
I think if you either you can write or you can't write, and you can apply your writing to a grant or you can apply your writing to a paper. So if somebody's not good at writing papers, they're not going to be good at writing grants. So I'm not sure that's for me, that's not the right analysis.
I guess I would argue a little bit that oftentimes when people are writing a paper, they're writing what they've done, and it's kind of a report of what they've done, whereas writing a grant really requires like forward thinking and what are you going to do type thing. So while writing is writing, it's a different mindset that it takes to get in the mind of writing a grant versus writing a paper.
This is Keith Kelly. I'd like to add that.
Well, go ahead, Keith.
I'd like to add that the answer is to that question is both. Senior investigators, professors that depend on the grant for funding the postdoc salaries, for funding their own salary, most often write a grant submission 3 times a year, every time an R01 comes up, and they publish papers. And that's because it takes at least a year to get your money from the day you submit the grant application. And I might say that's the dual-edged sword for an R21. I've seen many R21s be transformed into an R01. But you need to be careful because an R21 is only for 2 years. So after 1 year, you're going to be asked, if you want to continue the funding, you're going to have to submit another an R01. And if you don't have any papers to show that you successfully accomplished the goals of the R21, then that is a big mark against you. So the answer to that question, whether it's R21 or R01, really depends on how successful you are in getting the papers out the door in that first year.
Lily, did you want to add something?
No, I was just going to say that I agree with you. I think that writing a grant is a very different set of writing skills. So just like writing a novel is different than technical writing and scientific writing, I think that grant is very different. Also, I think that grant writing tends to be a lot more collaborative, and it requires a set of knowledge that is very different.
Any other questions or comments, or should I move on?
I think you can move on. There's nothing else in the chat.
So we've talked a little bit about how long things take. So I just want to go over a timeline. So this is a proposal preparation timeline. So if you think about, if you start here where like your submission date is 4 days before it has to be at NIH, you have to kind of look back in time. So months before the submission date, you should already be planning for the application. So 8 months, 9 months out, it's not too soon to assess yourself, assess the field, assess the resources, make sure what you're coming up with is a novel idea, have good hypothesis, you have good specific aims in mind. You're going to want to spend some time brainstorming, either with mentors or with colleagues. You're going to want to read the literature to make sure that you're current and that you're thinking about this in the right way. And if you can, call a program officer at NIH and talk about the idea you have. It often will help if you can develop a specific aims page with a hypothesis and aims and send that to the program officer. Well, as was mentioned earlier, they're not the ones doing the review, and they're really, really likely to be enthusiastic. Often the good ones have sat in and listened to study sections and can get an idea about whether there's going to be some big gap or some big hole that you're not filling in your aims page. The other thing is they know a lot about what their institute is interested in, so they can provide some feedback about that. I think it's a really good idea, especially for people just starting out, to set up your own review committee, to have some really, really good senior experienced people with NIH review your grant. You need to determine if you've got any specific human and animal requirements you need to deal with. And then once you've done that initial planning, you're going to need to spend several months sometimes writing the application. You're going to want to outline the application. You're going to want to develop your topics, your table of contents. You're going to want to start writing. In addition to the science parts of writing a grant, there are lots of other resources you have to have in place. You're going to need to write up about your research facilities. You're going to need to know whether you're going to have to use core facilities on campus. If so, you're going to need letters of support. You're going to have to think about whether you need a subcontract. Is there going to be somebody at another university that's critical to you getting your project done that you have to put a subcontract in place in case the grant gets funded so that they can receive the funding to do their part of the study? And through this whole process, as you're writing sections, it's really important to get feedback. I would get feedback from people in your field, but I also would get feedback from people that are peripheral to your field. Because when this goes to a study section, there's not going to be people there that are all doing identical to what you do. You have a high possibility that somebody in the general area might review your grant. You need to make sure that your writing is crisp and clean and can be understandable to people a little bit outside your field. You have to be making the point that your work is significant and innovative. And I think getting feedback from somebody that's not as familiar with your area is a really good way to do that. And on my particular study section, we're always asked to address two main questions. Should this be done, and can that be done? So you need to get feedback from other people about should it be done and can it be done. You need to proofread your application. There's nothing that annoys a reviewer at NIH more than tons of typos and sloppiness. It kind of sends a message that you're not careful in your grant application, you're not going to be careful in your experiments, and that raises some red flags. And so one thing I want to say is that I often get people asking me to give a pre-review of their grant application, and I'm happy to do it, but I need some time to be able to do a careful job. Do not ask somebody to review your grant the day before it's due. One, they're not going to have time to give it a good review. And if they come up with some really big issues, you're not going to have time to fix them. So really plan ahead and make sure you've got time to get the feedback, get the proofreading, get it submitted to SPA 4 days in advance so that it can get submitted to NIH. And so if you think about how long this planning, writing, and submission process happens, one thing you need to realize is after submission, it can be 4 months before you get the review, another 4 months before it goes to NIH Council, where they consider applications with certain scores for funding and given the priorities of NIH. And so every time a grant doesn't get funded, it can be about a year time elapsed between the initial submission and the resubmission. So you want to plan ahead and have good planning up front and not submit something sloppy or not well thought out, because you're just going to be wasting a lot of time. So after you submit your, go ahead.
Can we take a quick break? We had just a question. It's kind of related more to the last section. Can a non-tenure track research faculty apply for K-Series grants? And maybe Lillian might know more about this.
What is the question again?
Can a non-tenure track research faculty apply for K-Series grants?
No, well, if you have, I think you have to have a PhD. And they want to make sure that the institution in which you are at is going to be supportive of you, but you don't have to have a tenure track type position. There's also the 0099 mechanism that is actually supposed to be a transition type of grant that supports you before you actually have, it can start supporting you as a postdoc, for example, and then it carries you out as a tenure track professor once you get the job.
For the K-Series grants, if you're a non-tenure track faculty member, what often helps those grants, besides the good science, is a very strong letter of support from the institution that says that if you get the grant, you're going to have independent space and protected time, and ideally, if you can get it, it doesn't always happen, a statement that there would be a pathway towards a tenure track type situation. I've seen those a lot, but even if you can't get a commitment towards a pathway towards a tenure track, if you can have a commitment in space and protected time and resources that you'll need to do the project. That's more important than whether you're tenure track or not.
My experience is the answer is no. I've had that situation. If it's a tenure track faculty member, the application can go forward. If it's non-tenure track, that means that that person really doesn't access to the lab in any committed way, and the answer is generally, at least in my case, 2 times was no. It had to go under my name.
Yeah. I think
Yeah,
it's
I
gonna
have
be-
seen proposals being funded that were not in tenure track, but in the discussion, people did question that. But the institutional support looked strong enough, and the research idea was also strong enough. But I completely agree that being tenure track is a good thing.
But I would say not being tenure track shouldn't detract you from applying if the particular institute you're applying to will allow it, and if you can get a letter of support from the union. So after you submit the grant, it will go to the Center for Scientific Review, or CSR, and they will assign the application to an NIH institute and a scientific review group. In today's world, you're allowed to submit a cover letter that specifically asks for your grant to be assigned to a certain institute and a certain scientific review group or study section for review. NIH doesn't always abide by it, but a lot of times they will abide by that. So if you think that your grant is better to go to NIMH, write that in your cover letter. If you look at the study sections and you look at their panels and their rosters and you notice that there are people that have the expertise required to review your grant, you can suggest that study section as well. And then after it gets assigned to an institute or in a study section, that will be posted online in the ERA Commons, which you'll be able to access. And so you'll be able to look up what institute your grant's been assigned to, which study section. It'll even tell you the date that your grant will be reviewed, and it will tell you who is the scientific review officer, which is different than the program officer. So the scientific review officer is the government employee who will assign your application to reviewers and readers. This person really is not allowed to communicate with you at all about your grant, the review process. They will just assign it, and they're meant to be objective. And so that all of this information will be posted in the ERA Commons. And then generally it will take about, from submission to the review, will take about 4 months. But you'll know based on the ERA Commons when your study section is meeting. And then the scores have to be posted within 3 working days. And so you'll be able to check on Commons for the score of your application. And it will be posted within 3 working days. And then once you have the score, it's at that point that you also can contact your program officer, who is not the scientific review officer. You can ask that program officer for advice on whether you need to resubmit. Most program officers will tell you they'll talk to you once you have your summary statement, and then they can also give you some advice about revision if necessary. So this is just a little bit more detail about peer review. I know you're going to talk about this a lot more next week. So there's the initial review where the study section members will review and evaluate the application. They will give a score, scores to the application. Those will be available to use within 3 working days after the study section meets. As Lily mentioned, that the score alone does not tell you whether your grant will be funded. Those scores will go to a second level of review, which is the Advisory Council Board. Those typically happen about 4 months after the study section meets, depending on when your study section has met. And that board will review applications and decide on funding based on the score, based on their priority areas. And then at some point in this, you will also get a summary statement that's a summary of what the comments were on your grant, and those get posted in ERA Commons. They will post ones for new investigators and early stage career investigators first, and those can be posted anywhere between 2 and 3 weeks. And then more senior people, sometimes it takes a bit longer, but they try to get the early stage new careers out first. The other thing they do is they try to post summary statements in order of best scores to worst scores. So if your application has a good score, you'll get your summary statement quicker. If it was not discussed or you have a really poor score, they will wait longer to give you your summary statement, because the mindset is that this application is going to need a lot more work to revise, and that it's probably going to take more than the next deadline to get the application revised. So NIH doesn't give priority to getting those out. But that said, those all come within 8 weeks. And then if you get a good score and council approves funding of your grant, there's another set of requirements. So NIH will contact you. They will have questions related to their final administrative review and negotiating the award. They often ask for a list of all your other supports so they can check to make sure you don't have overlapping funding. They often might ask for more detailed budget information. It really depends on the situation, but generally there's a little bit of asking for more information and negotiating an award. Oh, the other thing they'll want to do is make sure if you're doing animal work, you've got approvals, or if you're doing human subjects work, that you have those approvals. And then you will get a notice of award, and then finally the project period begins and you have the money to do the science. So some other things about award management, really important to communicate with NIH staff if your application scores well in peer review. NIH staff will contact you and ask you to submit what's called just-in-time information. This is information related to your other support, related to having your proper approvals in place for animal work or human work. That information doesn't go directly from you. What'll happen is NIH will contact SPA. SPA will contact you and ask you for the information. You need to get that information back to SPA so that SPA can handle the award negotiation. And it's important to realize, even though when we get grants, we all feel like there are grants and this is our work, that's partially true in that we get to do the work and we got to write the grant, but the awards are made to the institution, not to us personally. And so SPA has to be the one handling the negotiation. And when you get your notice of grant award, you really need to pay attention to what it says as far as what you need to report back to NIH and how often, and whether there's any certain special restrictions related to the funding. And you have to make sure that you're following all of the rules of NIH and making your results and accomplishments of your research available to the public as required. Depending on what kind of research it is, most NIH institutes require you to publish your results. If you're doing things like RNA-seq, you're required to put your data in a public database. So you need to pay attention to what's required for your particular need. And then just some final words on interacting with NIH officials. So the scientific review officer, the SRO, that's the one that organizes the study section. They will assign reviewers for your grant. They will manage the entire pre-review. Sometimes they can contact you pre-meeting if they're asking for additional information. But you cannot and you should never contact them about anything related to the review process. It could really set you up for some trouble and look like you're interfering. And the other thing is you cannot request specific reviewers. While you can request a study section, you cannot request reviewers. One thing you can do when it is appropriate to contact the SRO about is if you look at the panel of reviewers and you notice have a major conflict of interest with somebody, you can write that SRO and ask them to exclude that person from the review process. But I would use that in a very limited fashion and only for severe conflicts. And then the program officers, these are the people you should talk to about the science, about whether your science fits into their institute, whether they have any comments or helpful suggestions in submitting or revising, and any technical aspects of it. So the scientific review officer, they analyze content of each application, they check it for completeness, they document and manage conflicts of interest, they recruit qualified reviewers based on science and technical qualifications, they assign applications for review, they oversee all the administrative and regulatory aspects of peer review meetings. They're the ones that prepare the summary statement. The program officer really communicates NIH program priorities and develops those requests for applications. They observe the review meetings. They can discuss issues brought up in the review with the applicants. They can prepare funding recommendations. It's really important if you can get a good relationship with a program officer, they can be really helpful in recommending your grant for funding. So say, for example, your grant is on the bubble and it's, it could go either way as far as the score. The program officer, if they're really interested in your science, they can really push that towards funding. They can help with evaluating the merit and mission relevance of your application. They can provide scientific guidance. They can monitor and will monitor the progress on your grant. And again, don't just contact program officers without a good concept in mind. If you can write your hypothesis and aims page, do that, and then get feedback from mentors and scientists in your field, and then send it to the program officer for input as well. And so in this concept paper or specific aims, you're going to really need to highlight what the problem is. Why do you need to do this? How does this fit into the organization's priority? Why is it significant? What is your hypothesis? What are you addressing? What are your goals? What in general is your design and analysis? And who will be your key participants and collaborators? And if you can do this in less than 2 pages to get feedback early on, I think that's a really good proactive way to do it. So I guess we'll stop there and leave time if we have a few minutes to discuss interacting with program officers.
Yeah, we actually have a couple questions too that are related more to funding mechanisms. So we might want to just address those first since we're starting to run short on time. So there was a question regarding the topic-specific R01 calls. Would it be expected that the same topic will be issued multiple times?
It depends. So the regular calls for R01s that they call investigator initiator, they don't necessarily have a topic. You just have to have a hypothesis and have science that fits into one of the NIH institutes. For the RFAs where they want a specific topic, sometimes it's only a call once. Sometimes they will renew that call. It really depends.
It's a question of money. The RFAs have funds set aside for them. So I saw 1 or 2 maybe on HIV 10 or 15 years ago. But I'd say generally the answer to that question is no, because it requires a set aside fund, which of course requires a little politics to get that done.
Okay, other question was, with regard to the K-series grants, what about research scientists? with a lot of support from your unit. So I guess kind of related to that tenure track question.
I think that for most of the case series, and Lily, maybe you can correct me, I think you have to have some sort of faculty appointment, unless it's the K99R00, where they're geared towards postdocs transitioning into a
I agree.
I would look at the specific K mechanisms, because I also know that they have different ones, and that should be outlined on the specific call for proposals.
All right. Do you all have any other advice for interacting with program officers? And Keith, we haven't heard too much from you. Do you want to start this?
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear that, Maggie.
Oh, I'm sorry. Would you like to speak a little bit more about your experience with interacting with program officers?
Generally bad. I think Jody was quite honest when she said that it so much depends on the program officer. They can say nothing at the study section meeting. All they can do is keep notes. And honestly, some of them don't even show up for the study section meeting. And so you call them, you say, what happened? They can't give you any information. That said, you don't want to get on the wrong side of a program officer. So my experience would be don't expect much, but that really and truly depends on the officer in question.
And just one last thing on program officers, when you find a good one, and I have found a good one, so I try to latch on to her, you can specifically request to continue working with that specific program officer. So keep that in mind.
Could I make a quick comment? I'm thinking of another, but going back to the question about non-tenure track, I may have to retract my statement on that because, you know, this whole issue of academic professionals, you probably, those in the audience may not be familiar with what academic professionals were, but that all changed about 4 or 5 years ago, and maybe Jody can help me out with this. As a result of that, a person that had worked for me for several years that was an academic professional became an assistant professor, non-tenure track. And I'm sorry, I don't forget the details. I forget the details. But that person now has had 2 R01s. So I want to retract what I said. And that's because I was thinking back to the academic professional days. But I think now the entire university is on this system. You can become an assistant professor, associate professor, full professor that is not tenure track. Is that right, Jody?
Yep, that's correct. And actually in many, like I know in our college, we have different tracks now. So we have the tenure stream faculty, but we even have a teaching track and then a research track. And those people can progress from assistant to associate to full professor, just like any other tenure stream
and
faculty.
They are eligible to write, at least in our department, they are eligible to write grants. And as I said, my former academic professionals had 2 R01s. So I retract what I said earlier.
When I've reviewed grants from non-tenure track people on our study section, as long as they have the resources they need, it's not a limitation. I don't think reviewers worry about it as long as they have the space and equipment.
But it's important, like you said, to emphasize that it requires that the department head and the college be on board because they are promising all the lab space, all the equipment to get the grant application successfully completed.
I don't have many more slides. I'll just say that this is a slide that just has a bunch of links to useful resources for everybody. And then this is just a reminder of the upcoming sessions that will happen.
Yeah. All right, if there are no more questions, thank you to everyone who attended today, and especially thank you to our panel for sharing your knowledge. It was really great, and also spending your time with us.
I did have a question. I think my microphone might not have been on.
Oh, sorry. One more question.
Can you just say a few words about the difference between NIH and National Science Foundation grants? I mean, how should one make a decision as to which way they should go?
So I have never written a grant for NSF because what I've been told, and I don't know if this is true, is that if it's anything that is health related, it goes to NIH, and I do health related work. If it's very basic, without path towards funding at NIH, like doesn't fit in their institute, it tends to be more NSF. I don't know, has somebody written NSF grants that knows a bit more?
I've had NSF grant, and you're absolutely correct. It must be basic science. If you put medicine or health in it, generally the reviewers will say that's not appropriate for NSF. One should also be aware that NSF has an entirely different review process. They simply collect the grant application, they send it out to 5 or 8 people, that it's all done outside the study section. And then a group of non-specialists, great scientists, but non-specialists, come together, who tally up those scores and decide who gets the money. And that's entirely different than what the NIH does. I prefer what the NIH does.
NIH has more money, isn't that true?
And another
Yes.
great point. Typically, the most I could ever get out of NSF, and it was only one time, was 3 years. Whereas you're at an associate full professor rank, you can generally expect 5. Oh, and by the way, in those days, it was like 300,000 or 400,000 direct cost. Now, a standard direct cost NIH grant would be 500. I forget the limit now. 500K, is that about right, Jody?
Yeah, yep,
Per
year.
Direct cost. So there's a huge difference.
The other thing too, I think NSF only has like one deadline a year, correct? Whereas NIH
Right.
has 3.
We are so fortunate in this country to have the opportunity to 3 times a year to submit grant applications. I don't know of any other country, from Germany to France, any other, Australia, that can submit 3 times a year. So imagine your life is depending on grant, and you've got once a year to go for it. So if you think writing a grant application is stressful, we're just count your blessings that we're here in the United States where we can submit 3 times a year.
Yeah, I want to say something too. It's my understanding that for NSF, they've started having kind of like a rolling submission date, so you can kind of submit at any time. And I don't know if that's for everything, but I feel like I've seen that on some announcements.
Good.
Where can we get a copy of this video?
I'll be sending a follow-up email probably tomorrow. And then I don't know if I'll have the video ready by then, but hopefully within the next week, it should be posted, and I will definitely alert all of you to that.
Are you putting it on MediaSpace?
It will probably go on MediaSpace, yes. Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks. Any other questions?
Thank you, Maggie.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.